Masechet Baba Batra, Daf Sadi Bet. We begin the sixth perek. The Mishnah teaches, Hamocher perot lachavero, uzra'an velo samchu, va'afilu zera pishtan, eno chayab ba'achariutan. As background, we have to understand that people buy and sell produce for two reasons. You might buy some produce for consumption, to eat or to press into oil or whatever. And the other option is to use it for planting. And some things that you buy are better for eating, some things are better for planting. So the buyer, if he specifies what it's for, and he says, I want this stuff specifically for planting, and he buys it, and then he plants it and treats it properly, and it doesn't grow, well, then he can get his money back. That's mekach ta'ut, it's a false sale. I bought this so that I can plant it and grow. Nothing grew, and therefore I want my money back. However, our Mishnah is talking about a case where the buyer did not specify, and it's an item that sometimes can be used for planting, and also sometimes people will buy the same item for consumption. So the Mishnah teaches that if someone sells produce to someone else, and the buyer plants it, and it does not grow, even if it's flax seeds, usually people buy it in order to plant it so that they can grow flax. Some people, however, a minority, will crush it and make oil out of it and consume it. Now, in such a case, even though most people use it for seed, what the seller is not responsible to pay for it because some people use it to consume. And so the seller can claim, listen, I sold you flaxseed. I assume that it was so that you can eat it and not to plant, and therefore it's not my problem that you planted it and it doesn't grow. If you specified that you want it, that you're buying it specifically to plant, then yes, I would be responsible. But you didn't say so, and some people do consume this item, and therefore I am not responsible. That's all Tanakama. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Zer onegina she'ena nechalin chaya b'achariutan. Rashbag says that seeds of garden plants that are not eaten, these seeds, nobody uses them to eat. Some seeds people eat or turn into oil. These seeds that are from garden plants, nobody eats. They're only used for planting. If they don't grow, the buyer has a valid claim and the seller has to give back his money. He is responsible for them. It's not clear if Rashbag is actually even arguing on Tanakama because this seems right in line with the same principle of Tanakama. The Gemara later on will discuss whether Rashbag is arguing on Tanakama or agreeing, but the basic principle is that if it's something that is only used for planting, then, as Rashbag says, the seller is liable. But if it's something that is sometimes used for planting and sometimes for consuming, even if most of the time it's used for planting, but some of the time people consume it, the seller is not liable. All right, that's all the Mishnah. The Gemara is now going to compare the case of selling seeds to the case of selling oxen, which also can be used for two different purposes. Sometimes people buy oxen to eat. They're going to slaughter it right away and eat it. Some people, however, buy oxen to use on the farm as work animals to plow. Now, the price for work animals generally is higher than that for meat, but as the Gemara will discuss. Itmar, hamocher shor lechavero v'nimsa nagchan. Rav amar hareze mikach ta'ut. Ushmuel amar yachol lomar lo lishchita mechartiv lecha. So we have a statement, a machloket between Amoraim. If someone sells an ox to his friend, and again, they don't specify why he's buying it, and it turns out it's a shor mu'ad. It was one that gores. It's very difficult to handle. Now, what difference does that make? It makes a difference if you're going to use it to plow. You're going to keep the animal alive and you want to use it, and it's a wild animal. That's not good. It's dangerous and you can't use it. If you're going to slaughter it, then it makes no difference what its behavior is. So, in this case, the buyer says, listen, I wanted to plow with it. I know he didn't say so in the beginning, but that's what he's claiming, that he bought it to plow, and it turns out you sold me a wild animal and I can't plow with it. I want my money back. Can the buyer claim that? Rav says, yes, the sale is a mistaken transaction. He bought an ox to plow, even though he didn't say so specifically, but that's a possibility. Many people buy oxen to plow, and the seller bought him an ox that is unusable, and therefore he has to pay the money back. Shmuel, however, says that the seller can say, listen, you didn't specify. I sold it to you for slaughter, so I didn't have to tell you that this is a wild animal, and the sale is valid. So that's a machloket between Rav and Shmuel. First, we're going to ask a few questions to clarify the exact details of the case, and then we're going to bring challenges against Rav and Shmuel. So we ask, well, why don't we examine the case and see the buyer? Is this a buyer who generally buys things for slaughter? Does he own a butcher shop? Does he own a slaughterhouse? Well, then we can assume that he bought it to slaughter. In which case, Shmuel would be right. As the seller says, "I know you. You're a butcher. Of course, you're buying it to slaughter, and therefore you have no case against me." Whereas, if the buyer is someone who owns a farm and he plants things and he needs work animals, and he usually buys oxen for that, then we can assume that he bought it to plow, and in that case, Rav would be right. So, and Shmuel should agree in the case where the buyer generally buys things as work animals, then everybody, even Shmuel, should agree that it's a bad sale. Whereas if he's a butcher, the buyer owns a slaughterhouse, then Rav should agree with Shmuel that the sale is valid. The seller says, "I know you. You're a butcher, and that's why I sold you muad. You cannot come and have any claim against me." So why don't we look at what kind of buyer it is? So we answer, the machloket between Rav and Shmuel would only apply if the buyer is someone who buys sometimes for slaughter and sometimes for work animals. Maybe he owns a slaughterhouse and he also owns a farm. Or maybe he's a middleman and he buys it and he sells it to other people. Whatever it is. So he generally buys for both different purposes, and therefore we can't tell based on his prior behavior. Okay, there's another way to tell what his intentions are. He didn't say specifically what his intentions were. That would have made it clear, and then there would be no problem. But even though he didn't express his intentions, we can tell what they were based on the price that he paid. Because let's say an animal for slaughter goes for $100, a work animal goes for $200. So let's see, did he pay $200 or did he pay $100? And then we'll know what his intention was. And if in fact he paid the higher amount to $200 and the seller gave him a wild animal, then it would be a false sale according to everybody. And if not paid $100, then everybody would agree that it's a valid sale. So we answer, Lasricha de iyakar bisra vekam b'dmei. Oh, this machloket between Rav and Shmuel, you're right. If there was a big difference in price, they would both agree. You could look at the price. But this machloket only applies to a case where the price of meat on the market went up, way up, and it ends up being the same price. Meat is expensive, and so in order to buy an ox, whether as a work animal or for slaughter, is $200 for both. That's the case we're talking about, so we can't tell. Then we ask about that. If so, then what's the difference to the buyer if he bought, let's say, in fact, he wanted a work animal, and he got this animal and it's a wild animal, but it's the same price. So if he can't use it to work, then the buyer can easily just go and sell it on the market again to a butcher and get the $200 back. In other words, why do we have to invalidate the sale? There will be no loss to the buyer anyway. All right, the buyer says, "Hey, it's a wild animal. I can't use this," and he'll flip it to the butcher and get back his $200. Why do you have to say it's an invalid sale and the seller has to give back the $200? There's no difference to the buyer. And the answer is nafkamina letircha. There is a difference, not in terms of money. He'll get his $200, but there's a difference in terms of effort. For this farmer now, he wants to go work his land. Now he has to go take this ox, take it to the market, find a buyer, get the money, make a transaction. He doesn't want to deal with that. He's not buying and selling oxen all day. He wants to concentrate, so it's a pain in the neck. And that's why he would have a valid claim to go back to the buyer, back to the seller, and say, this is not what I bought, I wanted a work animal. Now we ask further, Hechidami, what are the particulars of the case? Idaleka li ish talume mine liakab Torah bezuzeh. Damari inashe min mare rashvatech pare ipara. If the seller does not have sufficient funds to repay the buyer, in other words, we're talking about a case where the buyer says, I wanted to use a work animal, and he paid $200 to the seller. The seller went, and he spent the money already. He doesn't have the money around anymore. This question is primarily on Rav, who says that this is a mekach ta'ut, and the seller has to pay him back. But if it's a case where the seller doesn't have cash available, then the buyer should, in any case, keep the ox instead of the money. As people say, and a common folk saying, you should take even bran from someone who owes you money. A bran is a very cheap thing, but it's worth something. So if someone owes you money and they said, listen, I don't have cash, I'll give you bran. Take it, because better than nothing, better to get paid even with something cheap, a lot of something cheap, than cash, even though cash is better. Bran is a pain, you're going to have to go and use it, sell it somehow. But nevertheless, if there's someone's offering to pay you back, take whatever they are offering. And so that would be our advice also to this buyer. In other words, according to Rav, even if you say that the buyer has a valid claim, and he can say, I wanted the farm animal like most people use it for as work animals, and you sold me the swallow animal, I want my money back. But if it's a case where the seller doesn't have any cash, then the buyer should just keep the animal anyway. And so in that case, Rav would in effect agree with Shemuel. So is that what the case is talking about? And the answer is no. No, the machloket is only in the case where the seller does have sufficient funds to reimburse the buyer. And that's when Rav would say that the seller has to give him back the $200 and he takes back his wild ox. But you're right, if it was a case that the seller didn't have money, then Rav would agree that we would advise the buyer, listen, just keep the ox, because better to have an ox that's valuable, that's worth $200, and although it's going to be more of a pain, you have to go and sell it, that's better than giving it back and then he's just going to owe you the money. You may never see that repayment. Okay, now that we've established with several limitations on this machloket, we're minimizing the machloket. Maybe the Gemara wants to say, you know what, Rav and Shemuel, for 90% of cases, they actually agree with each other. But there is a sliver of cases, if it fulfills all of the checkboxes that we just said, then yes, there would be a machloket between them. Now we're going to explain their reasoning and offer a challenge against it. Rav Amar, Hareze mikach ta'ut bataruba azlinan, veruba liridja zabne. Ushmuel Amar lach, ki azlinan bataruba bi'isura, b'mamona la. Rav says that this is a false sale because we follow the majority. The majority of animals that are bought on the market are bought to use as work animals. That was simply the reality back then. Today, obviously, is different. We have tractors, so most animals are sold for slaughter. But back then, they needed a lot of work animals. So therefore, we follow the majority. If the buyer claims, I bought this as a work animal, even though he didn't specify, we believe him. We trust that that was his intention, and therefore the seller is in the wrong to sell him something that's a wild animal without having said so before, and therefore the purchase is an invalid sale and the buyer gets his money back. Rav says we follow the majority. Shemuel says, I agree with the majority rule, however, that's only when it comes to isura, prohibitions. For example, you find a piece of meat in the street and there are 10 butchers around it, and you don't know which butcher this meat came from. So you look at the majority and see if the majority of the butchers are kosher, you can assume that this meat is kosher as well. So we do follow the majority when it comes to deciding if something is permitted or prohibited. But when it comes to monetary matters, we cannot follow the majority. If you want to extract money, in this case, the buyer is trying to extract money from the seller. The seller has the cash, the sale already went through, he got the cash. The buyer has to prove 100% that he meant to buy this as a work animal. And he can't just follow the majority. We don't follow the majority when it comes to extracting money. Let's say there's a notorious robber in town and he's responsible for 90% of the robberies in the town. And then I get robbed. Can I go and make the claim against that notorious robber and say, well, you do most of the robberies, therefore you have to pay? I can't do that. The robber that notorious robber can say, I didn't do this one. Those 10% are done by somebody else. So I wouldn't be able to extract money from this robber, not just because he does the majority of robberies. I would have to prove that he was in fact the one that took my money. And the same thing here. The seller says, well, majority, but you can't extract money from me based on a majority statistic. You have to prove that that is what you meant. If you can see based on the receipt of the price, and look, you paid a bigger amount, not a smaller amount, right? That's a way to prove it. If you can prove that you generally buy work animals, right? Look at the past, all the things you bought in the past. You're not a butcher, you're only a farmer. Okay, that would be proof. But otherwise, we're not going to follow majority. So now this is a pretty fundamental machloket, whether we can follow majority in monetary matters or not. And so we're going to bring several arguments, challenges against Rav and Shemuel, and the first one is a challenge against Rav. And this comes from a monetary matter having to do with a ketubah, the payment that a husband has to give his wife, let's say upon divorce, depends on if she was a bitula, a virgin, this was her first marriage, then the amount of the ketubah is 200. However, if she was previously married, and she is a widow, then or divorcee, then she only gets 100. Now, there's a controversy about this. What happens? Metibe. Haisha shenit almena o nitgaresha. V'omeret betula niseti. V'omer lo ki ela almana nesatich. Im yesh edim sheyasea behinuma v'rosha parua ketubata matayim. A woman who was widowed or divorced from this husband, and if she was widowed, then it wouldn't be the husband that she's arguing with, but rather the husband's heirs, and she's trying to get money from the inheritors. So let's talk about a case of divorce where the husband is still alive, but it would be the same principle. And she says, when we got married, I was a betula, it was my first marriage, and you have to pay me 200 zuz. And the husband says, no, not true. When I married you, you had already been widowed from a previous guy, and therefore I only owe you 100. Now, nowadays we write it in the ketubah, but for some reason, let's say they didn't write it, and they have to prove one way or another. Now, if there are witnesses that remember the wedding, and a wedding ceremony for a betula is different from that for that of an almana. When it's a betula, someone's first wedding, then the bride would wear a veil, and her head was not covered. Whereas if she was an almana, second marriage, did not wear a veil, and her head would be covered. So, if there are witnesses, either that she wore a veil or that her hair was uncovered, then the witnesses are proving that this was her first marriage. She is a betula, and then she gets 200. Okay, that is what the Mishnah says in Masechet Ketubot. Let's analyze. Tama diika edim, haleka edim la, ve'amai, lema halech ahad rov hanashim, ve'rov nashim betulot nisaot. The reason why she would get 200 in this last case is only because there are witnesses that remember that she wore a veil. But if there were no witnesses, then she wouldn't. The burden of proof is on the bride to bring witnesses that this was her first marriage, otherwise she only gets 100. Now, according to Rav, we have a question. Rav, how will you explain this Mishnah? Rav says that we follow majority. In this case also, you should follow the majority of women. The majority of marriages are cases where it's the woman's first marriage. Only sometimes is a woman widowed or divorced and then enters a second marriage. Most women are bitulot when they get married. So why don't we say, even without witnesses, let's follow the majority and assume that this is her first marriage, unless the husband proves otherwise. So according to Rav, if you say this is a monetary matter, even though it has to do with marriage, but it has to do with the payment of the ketubah. So why do you need witnesses? Why don't you follow the majority? Okay, good question against Rav. Amar Ravina, Mishum dika lememar, Rov nashim betulot nisaot, umiut almanot, vechol aniset betula yesh la kol, vezo ho'il ve'en la kol, itra la ruba. Ravina explains that in this case, the husband could offer the following argument. It is true that a majority of women who get married are bitulot at their marriage, and only a minority of brides are almanot. So on one side, you have that's true, the majority of marriages are bitulot, and therefore, if we just had that, yes, we could assume that she was a bitula and you would have to pay 200. However, there's a counter argument that undoes the majority, and that is the fact that anyone who gets married for the first time as a bitula, that marriage will have publicity. Generally, a first marriage, right? Lots of people are going to be invited. It's going to be a big wedding. Everybody's going to know it. Everybody's going to hear about it. And so you'd expect that everybody would say, oh, that wedding, yes, sure. We all remember it. And she was wearing a veil and she was a bitula. But in this case, nobody remembers it except for two witnesses, but otherwise nobody knows. So the fact that in this case there is not publicity, see, when someone gets married for the second time, then usually they have a small wedding. It's not as public. Not everybody knows about it. So the fact that most people don't know about the wedding, that actually proves the opposite, that this must have been not her first wedding. So the fact that there is not publicity undermines the majority, and so they break even, and that's why you need witnesses in this case. That's how Rav would explain this case. So Rav says, in general, you can follow a majority for monetary matters. In this case, there is a majority, but there's another factor that undermines the majority. Okay, we're going to challenge Ravina. I kol hanisot betulot yesh lahen kol, ki ka'edim ma'haveh, midilet la kol sahadeh shakarenin hu. Wait a second, Ravina. If it's true that anyone who gets married as a betula, there will be publicity for that marriage, in that case, how will witnesses even help? In other words, nobody remembers it, right? And you'd expect that everybody would have remembered it because if it was a first wedding. And now nobody remembers it except two witnesses. But from the fact that there's no publicity, that actually undermines even those two witnesses, which is quite an amazing thing. It'll be the equivalent of saying, let's say everybody's at a football game, and then two witnesses come and say, oh, in the middle of the game, right on the field, this guy committed a murder. But no, there's 40,000 people in the stands and not one person saw it. If that happened, then all the fans should have seen it, right? Or at least a lot of them. It would make publicity. It would have made the news. So can you trust two, even though there are two witnesses, which is really quite amazing, because two witnesses usually we say is 100% proof and you can kill someone based on that. But here we're saying if there's a fundamental reason to distrust the witnesses, because if the event that they testify about really happened, there would have been publicity. There's lots of people there and no one remembers, nobody knew about it, that undoes the witnesses. And so if you're talking about, if you really say that every bitula wedding makes publicity and there's no publicity in this case, then we can't even trust the witnesses that say we saw her with a veil. So rather we're going to modify what Ravina said. Ela rov hanisaot betulot yesh lahen kol vezo ho'il ve'en la kol itra la ruba. The majority is a little different. Most of women who get married as betulot will have publicity, but not everybody. There are some people who, even though it's a first wedding, they want to have a small, modest, family-only, just in the house, COVID wedding, and it doesn't make a big deal. They don't tell people about it. They don't invite a lot of people. So that happens sometimes. So therefore, if there are two witnesses that say, oh yes, we were there, we saw it, right? They were part of the small group of people that were invited, and that's why other people don't know. So it's possible. If there are witnesses, we will trust the witnesses. But in this case, since there is no publicity, that lack of publicity undermines the majority. So we have, on the one hand, the majority of women when they get married are betulot. If we just had that fact, then yes, we would believe that she's a betula and she would get 200 even without witnesses. The problem is there's no publicity here. And most first-time marriages have publicity. So that majority undermines the other majority. These two majorities cancel each other out. And therefore, we have to rely on witnesses. Why would we believe two witnesses? Well, we still believe them because sometimes a betula will have a small wedding that nobody knows about it. So we will trust the two witnesses if they come. But again, we answer the question on behalf of Rav because Rav would say, in general, we follow a majority for monetary cases, but in the case of a wedding, the lack of publicity will undermine that majority. Next, we have a challenge against Shemuel, support for Rav. Tashema. Hamocher ebed lachavero v'nimsa ganab o kubyustos higi'o. Listim mizuyan o muchtav lamalchut omer lo hare shelecha lefanecha. Someone sells a slave to his friend, and it turns out that the slave is a thief or a cubist, not the type of painter, but rather someone who plays with cubes, meaning a gambler. And he says, what'd you sell me? You sold me the slave? Look, he's a thief, he keeps stealing from me, or he's gambling. The problem with gambling isn't simply that he's wasting time, it also means he's an untrustworthy person, that's a bad character. In that case, the seller says, I gave it to you, the sale is valid, no return. That's not sufficient of a deficiency for the sale to be invalid. The question will be from this. But it continues. If it turns out he bought this slave, and the slave is an armed bandit, or he's been judged by the kingdom to be executed, in that case, the buyer can say, take it back. This slave, I leave before you, and you have to give me my money back. That is considered no good, an invalid sale. All right, so there's a difference between the severity of the character, of how bad the character and actions of the slave are. The first ones aren't quite as bad. Now, why do you say that's okay? Why is it a valid sale? Resha, my ta'ama, la mishum tirubahachi itnehu. After all, he is a thief. So who wants to buy a slave that's a thief? So is it not that it's a valid sale because the majority of slaves are thieves or gamblers, and therefore the seller can say, listen, this is the majority, so you should have expected it. The buyer can say, oh, I wanted the minority case of, I want to demand only an honest slave. No, you can't say that because we follow the majority. This proves that we do follow the majority in monetary cases. This is a monetary case. Can he get his money back or not? And this is a proof for Rav that we follow the majority. The majority of slaves are, in fact, thieves or gamblers, and so the seller can say, I'm relying on the majority cases, and therefore it's a valid sale. You should have expected this. And that would be a challenge against Shemuel. We answer, La kulehu hachi itnehu. No, in fact, all slaves are either thieves or gamblers. This is not based on the majority. This is based on an absolute generalization that's true all the time. And therefore, in the first case, it's a valid sale. The seller can say, you were buying a slave. What'd you expect? All slaves are thieves and gamblers. So you can't come to me now and say, oh, I wanted an honest one. There are no honest ones, and therefore the sale is valid. We'll see more challenges on the next daf. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.